Welcome back. This is week 2, lecture 1, under the title European Conquest, Exploration, and Colonialization. Now, just a note on the title. If you look on the syllabus, it just says European Exploration and Colonialization. Um, I have included then the word conquest for reasons I think will be clear as we go along, because exploration, conquest, and colonialization all went together. Anyway, so I hope that doesn't confuse you too much. But this lecture is following up on the previous lecture dealing with the Reformation and the transformation of Christendom, where we saw that the medieval world was radically changing in the 16th century. Now, at the same time that those religio-political movements were going on, there were other factors in that Europe, or Europeans in any case, were beginning to explore. So that's what we're looking at here. So this is a kind of a parallel development, even though I will be talking about issues that go beyond what we talked about last lecture as well, both chronologically and in a larger context. So this is all about setting up where the course starts in 1648, so to speak, with the end of the 30 Years' War, and when the textbook picks up. So that's what this is kind of all about. And to really grasp how, for the Europeans, this period of from the later 15th century on into the 16th century and 17th century was a completely new world for them. And it kind of blew the minds of Europeans, because all of a sudden they realized there was a lot more there than they ever thought. But we'll see how that goes when we get there, because they knew a lot more than we often think they did. So, that being said, we have to look at Christendom and the development of this idea of exploration, which went hand in hand with missionary zeal. Because all of a sudden, if there are other souls out there, we need to win those souls for God. That was kind of the idea. And what so often in our minds today seem contradictory, in that this religious theological zeal going along with profit and greed. For the medieval mind, there was no contradiction. Those were one and the same. And it's important to see that, because if we put it in that dichotomous issue of one cannot be sincere in one's ideals of religious conversion and missionary activity on the one hand, and then greed and exploitation on the other, we won't understand the period. So we have to try to imagine what it might be like to see that there was no contradiction for them, that they were one and the same, even if we see a contradiction in it. So we have to try to put ourselves back into the mindset of Europeans in the later Middle Ages on into the early modern times, to understand what they were doing and how they were going about it. So that's kind of what this is about. And to talk about all of this, we're going to begin actually further back in the Middle Ages. We're going to begin with the period of the Crusades. The Crusades. Crusades are often seen as one of the most intriguing aspects of medieval Europe. It's not one of the areas I focus on, but it's in my period, certainly. Um, and it's a time when Europeans began to look outward. The development of Christendom from Charlemagne through the end of the 9th or 10th centuries was very much one of consolidation and looking inward, whereby, as one scholar, John Van Engen, has wrote a number of years ago in a very famous article that's repeated all over the place, Christianization of the Middle Ages, Europe then became Christian. Christendom became Christian, except for the Jews. And I'll be talking about that as well today. And so by around the year 1000, Christendom, the boundaries of Christendom was all Christian. It had already converted the pagans, quote unquote, and that's another issue in terms of what that entailed, but simply following baptism in the Christian worship, not so much personal belief. And at this time, they begin to say, okay, now what? Now what? There's a lot of infighting among Christian princes. And the popes thought, this is not really good. Christian princes shouldn't be fighting other Christian princes. They have started trying to impose rules on battle and fighting, and all of a sudden there was an opportunity. And Pope Urban II in 1095 gives a speech at Clermont calling for a holy war. All of a sudden, it's like, if we can garnish all this, what we would call it today, almost testosterone or toxic masculinity of inner fighting, if we can somehow manage that and focus it outward on a common enemy, that will help. Now, what was going on there? The emperor in the east, which is still there, in Constantinople, talked to the Pope or sent a message to the Pope saying, we need help. And this is really interesting because in 1054, so just 40 years previously, the Greek Church, part of the Eastern Roman Empire, and the Latin Church, Christendom, agreed to disagree. And they agreed that they would no longer consider each other basically the same. That's called the Great Schism of 1054. So shortly after that, all of a sudden, the Emperor of the East is like, we need help. And Pope Urban saw this as a great way to assert our supremacy over the East, so that Christendom is not just Europe, but also the Eastern Roman Empire. Now, what was the need for help? The incursion of Islam. Muhammad dies in 632, and Islam began to spread. And by 637 already, Islamic forces had captured the territory that was referred to as Palestine. Now, certainly this is also going to be important for later lectures as we get into the 20th century, late 19th, 20th century, in terms of what was going on in the Middle East, which is central for understanding what's going on right now in the Middle East. And I'm just talking about the historical development, and we'll see what I'm talking about by that. Now, the term Palestine was a region. It's also kind of referred to as the Levant in a general sense. But Palestine was a Roman province. It had become named Palestine only in 135 CE after the final suppression of Jewish revolts. There had been a number of them. In 70 CE, the temple was destroyed after a Jewish revolt against Roman authority and power. And then in 135, the province, the territory that had been referred to and named as Judea, was renamed by the Romans as Palestina, Syria, Palestine. It's a territory. Now, that territory, known to Christians and Jews as the Holy Land, was overrun and taken over and conquered by Islamic forces in 637, just 5 years after Muhammad's death. Problem here is both the Jews, who were now in what's called the diaspora, because where they did have a territorial political entity, I'm not going to say a state as such, but it was an entity, and I'm not going to go into the whole biblical history of the traditions or the biblical tradition of the United Kingdom under David and Solomon, because that's actually there's very little historical evidence to no historical evidence that was ever an issue, but that's another issue. But the Jewish people who were living in the region of Judea then revolted against Roman power, trying to assert their own authority to rule themselves. That failed. It was crushed in 70 CE. The temple was destroyed, and that begins the diaspora. And then in 135, there was a last gasp of Jewish hope to reestablish their territory. That was crushed. And then the Romans said, okay, we've had enough of this. We're not going to call it Judea anymore. We're going to call it Palestina, Syria, Palestine. There is the word Palestine actually goes back further. I think Herodotus is the first person to refer to Palestine as that region, that geographical territory. but it was a Roman province, and Islam had conquered it, taken it over, and was threatening Constantinople. And that is why the emperor said to the Pope, please help, because the forces of Islam are threatening us. You know, that's kind of the background. The problem here was religion and belief, because the region of Palestine, for the Jewish tradition, was considered to be the promised land. It is what God had promised Abraham and his descendants. And if you've read the Hebrew Bible or the Christian Old Testament, a lot of the earlier discussions are about the conquering of the Holy Land, fighting against the Canaanites and all these other people to establish themselves in this territory that, according to Jewish tradition, God had granted them, based on Abraham and then his son Isaac. Well, the problem is Abraham had two sons. His first son was named Ishmael. And Ishmael was the son of Abraham and his wife Sarah, his wife Sarah's slave, Hagar. And supposedly, as the story goes, we have no idea if this was historical at all. But this is the story. Okay? So this is not historical, what's verifiable historically. But it's the story that the Jewish people were telling themselves. Okay? That's the big distinction to make. That since Sarah could not give birth, they had tried, it wasn't working. Sarah said, okay, Abraham, please, sleep with my slave girl, and that he will be your, the offspring will be your heir. So Abraham does that. Hagar bears Ishmael. And then the miracle of Sarah, all of a sudden being divinely told that she would give birth, and both Sarah and Abraham laughed about that because they were too old, or Sarah was too old. But it came about that Sarah did conceive and gave birth to Isaac. So all of a sudden, Abraham had a quote-unquote legitimate heir with his wife rather than the son of himself, his wife's slave. And so they thought, okay, there's going to be tension there. And so Abraham and Sarah then expelled Hagar and Ishmael. And the tradition, then the Jewish tradition, goes from Abraham to Isaac and Jacob and then everybody else. Fine. That's the origins of the Promised Land story. It goes back to Moses and all those things. None of which there's historical evidence for, but those are the stories about this region, this geographical territory that was Roman province. With Muhammad, the revelations of Muhammad, part of the backstory of Muhammad and the revelations Muhammad received was that the Muslims, or Islam, descended from Ishmael. So the tradition goes from Abraham to Ishmael up through Muhammad and the Arab peoples that then now were becoming converted to Islam. It's the same tradition in many ways, but a different twist on it. And according to Islamic tradition, God had promised the descendants of Ishmael the same territory. So what do? You can't say, well, because they came afterwards by some, well, it depends on how we date it. When Moses is pretty early on, if we accept the historical account, and so is Abraham is early on if we accept the historical account, but even textually, we have textual evidence of these stories being told in the 5th, 6th, and 5th centuries BCE. Then some 1,000 years later, we have the Islamic stories. But if we're talking about divine promises and revelation, we can't really say that one outweighs the other. And historians cannot appeal to divine revelation. So I'll just put it that way. So there's a conflict over who has the right to this geographical territory that after 135, before 135 CE, so 500 years before Islam, the Romans renamed Palestine. because it had been named Judea. They were sick and tired of Jewish revolts, and they said, we're going to get rid of this once and for all. There we go. So Islam then conquered the territory of Palestine in 637. And 400 years later, they start making incursions. It already conquered Jerusalem. They start making incursions on Constantinople. And in 1095, after receiving the plea from the emperor in the east, Pope Urban says, okay, we can do something to help, and that will be good for us too. We'll be able to show that we're actually are supreme and superior, and you should have been following us all along. So he gives this speech at Clermont in 1095, calling for a holy war against the infidel, against the Saracens. I mean, Islam was called the Saracens. They were also called later referred to as Turks. We can help. He said it's incumbent upon every Christian prince to go to war against Islam in the East, to retake the Holy Land, and to free Constantinople from Islamic threats. And they do that. A massive undertaking. And the First Crusade, as it's called, was, from the Christian perspective, an overwhelming success. They did conquer and take back the Holy Land, and they did provide at least a buffer zone for Constantinople. And in doing so, this is, again, I'm trying to keep from getting into too much detail from all of this. In doing so, then, after they conquered the Holy Land, they established what became known as the Latin Kingdom of Jerusalem. It was great. The Pope said, okay, first of all, with this holy war, since it is against the infidel, you are absolved from any sins you may commit in the prosecution of this war. Number one. Number two, whatever you take, whatever you conquer, is rightfully yours. That was the motivation for kings and princes and emperors to go on crusade. Missionary zeal, Christian faith, as well as greed and potential wealth. One and the same. Now, how do they go about it? It's pretty gruesome. I'm just going to read you a couple short passages, relatively short passages, from the Chronicle of Fulcher of Chartres. Fulcher of Chartres actually went on the First Crusade. He was a scholar. He accompanied the King of France, and then wrote about it afterwards. And he writes about the conquering of Jerusalem. It's a fantastic chronicle because also he talks about military tactics and how they sieged Jerusalem and all these other things, and it's very detailed and in some ways very gruesome. And this is just, first of all, the section about the conquering of the temple. So this is from Fulcher of Chartres' Chronicle, which was basically an eyewitness account. Count Raymond, which is one of the princes on crusade, and his men who were attacking the wall around Jerusalem on the other side did not yet know all of this. This is his previous accounts of the siege of Jerusalem, until they saw the Saracens, Muslims, leap from the wall in front of them. Forthwith they joyfully rushed into the city to pursue and kill the nefarious enemies, as their comrades were already doing. Some Saracens, Arabs, and Ethiopians took refuge in the Tower of David. Others fled to the temples of the Lord and of Solomon. A great fight took place in the court and porch of the temples, where they were unable to escape from our gladiators. Many fled to the roof of the Temple of Solomon and were shot with arrows, so that they fell to the ground dead. In this temple, almost 10,000 were killed. Indeed, if you had been there, you would have seen our feet colored to our ankles with the blood of the slain. But what more shall I relate? None of them were left alive. Neither women nor children were spared. Now, that is pretty gruesome. The 10,000, just a little bit, a note on that. At this time, the Middle Ages and on for a fair amount of time into early modern Europe, numbers in such cases were used more as adjectives than, detailed accounts. It's not that they went and counted how many were slain in the Temple of Jerusalem. 10,000 just means a whole lot of people. And obviously, if it was rising blood to the ankle level, that's a lot of blood. There are biblical references there, and imagery, which is a way to interpret this event. What does it mean? How does it go about it? And then just in the end of the chronicle, he ends it this way. And this, I think, is a very good insight into the mentality at the time of the Crusaders. So this is how it ends. Consider, I pray, and reflect how in our time God has transferred the West into the East. For we who are Occidentals, or Westerners, now have been made Orientals, or Easterners. He who was a Roman or a Frank is now a Galilean or an inhabitant of Palestine. One who was a citizen of Rheims or of Chartres now has been made a citizen of Tyre or of Antioch. We've already forgotten the places of our birth. Already they have become unknown to many of us, at least are unmentioned. Some already possess here homes and servants which they have received through their inheritance. Some have taken wives not merely of their own people, but Syrians or Armenians or even Saracens who have received the grace of baptism. Some have with them father-in-law or daughter-in-law or son-in-law or stepson or stepfather. There are here too grandchildren and great-grandchildren. One cultivates vines, another the fields. The one and the other use mutually the speech and idioms of the different languages. Different languages, now made common, become known to both races, and faith unites those whose forefathers were strangers. As it is written, the lion and the ox shall eat straw together. Those who were strangers are now natives, and he who was a sojourner now has become a resident. Our parents and relatives from day to day come to join us, abandoning, even though reluctantly, all that they possess. For those who were poor there, here, God makes rich. Those who had few coins here possess countless bezants, which are gold coins. Those who had not yet had a villa here, by the gift of God, already possess a city. Therefore, why should one who has found the East so favorable return to the West? God does not wish those to suffer want who, carrying their crosses, have vowed to follow him, nay, even unto the end. You see, therefore, that this is a great miracle, and one which must greatly astonish the whole world. Who has ever heard anything like it? Therefore, God wishes to enrich us all and to draw us to himself as his most dear friends. And because he wishes it, we also freely desire the same. And what is pleasing to him, we do with a loving and submissive heart, that with him we may reign happily throughout eternity. So ends the Chronicle of Fulker of Chartres. That mentality of this is God's will and we are submissive to God's will. The Latin Kingdom of Jerusalem didn't last all that long, actually, except in name. It was lost in the Second Crusade, and there was a series then of actually 8 crusades, officially numbered 8 crusades, through the end of the 13th century. And after the glorious First Crusade, based on Christian views, the others were not nearly as successful. And the crusading spirit started to wax and wane. To wane, not wax. Wax is up, wane is down. Started to wane and dissipate. And that led to all kinds of developments, which I'm not going to talk about here too much. I'll get too much into the details. And it also included the development of the theory of indulgences, which then in some ways, attributed to the Reformation. That's another issue. But it was this idea of this is the land that God has given us, and that we are reconquering the Holy Land that was promised after Islamic forces had conquered it in 637, taking it back for us. Now, there's also the issue of the Crusaders, I guess, into a long history of Christian anti-Judaism or anti-Semitism. because we see a real uptick, rise in anti-Judaism, anti-Semitism in around the Crusade. And the first pogroms in Europe are really around the Crusaders, because their idea was, my gosh, we're going all the way over to the Holy Land to fight the infidel, where we had, Jews who are not Christians are not really infidels, but they're close. Why don't we start here? And so there was those issues that really started there. But then the Christian-Jewish relationships within Europe was very complex. The short of the matter is that there were waves of anti-Semitic outbreaks, and other times that there were relative peace and harmony, relatively. The popes, in general, supported the Jews, so it gets to be a really messy situation. And that continued on to the 16th century. Anyway, that's some of that background. But all the other crusades were not nearly as successful, even though it's still the Latin Kingdom of Jerusalem. The King of Naples still retained the King of Jerusalem in his title for quite a long time. And I believe the King of Spain now still has the title King of Jerusalem. Anyway, it's based on claims, based on faith and belief. When the political reality is, after the First Crusade, it went back and forth a bit, and it didn't really work out. And finally, in 1453, Islamic forces finally did capture Constantinople in the fall of Constantinople in 1453. So in some ways, it was all for naught in that sense. Now, other crusades were proclaimed once we have the theory of crusadings. I talked about Pope John the 22nd and his fight against Louis of Bavaria. He proclaimed a crusade against Louis of Bavaria because the idea of a crusade was a holy war. So there's the 8 crusades, and then proclaiming, let's say, military action, papal military action, as a crusade against. There was the Albigensian crusade, other things against heretics. That idea of crusade, of crusading fervor, of conquering, of converting, was very much still in the mind and mentality of Christendom. It was part of it, the expansion of Christendom. And we'll come back to all of this again later on in the course when we get to the problem of the Middle East and the time. That was partly of what was going on here, but it's also a background to this idea of why go out and explore. They'd already gone out and conquered the Middle East, the Holy Land, Palestine. And since that kind of fell apart, were there other areas and territories that we can, number one, convert, and number two, enrich ourselves from? Now, at the time, they knew about Africa, and they knew about Asia. And a Portuguese prince, Prince Henry the Navigator, starts to explore. Now, I will come back to that momentarily, but first, I'm going to talk about another development briefly that was going on at the same time. Because just as the Crusades are kind of ending in the end of the 13th century, beginning of the 14th century, we have a new movement in Europe that has been called the Renaissance. Now, I have a whole class on the Renaissance. It hasn't been taught for quite a while because a lot of it I subsume into my class on late medieval Europe, high and late medieval Europe. But traditionally, the Renaissance has been seen as one of the beginnings of modernity, along with the Reformation. That is absolutely not the case, but I'd have to go into all of that. I just want to mention a number of things very briefly in terms of developments that were going on in the later Middle Ages that led to this transformation of Christendom and the emergence of early modern Europe. And this idea of Renaissance is a rebirth. A rebirth of what? It's a rebirth of classical culture. Now, the concept of the Renaissance was actually a creation of the Swiss historian Jakob Burckhardt in the 19th century, who wrote a 2-volume work on the civilization of Italy in the Renaissance. Burckhardt was a brilliant historian. But what he did was accept the interpretation of scholars in the 15th century as the reality. And those scholars in the 15th century, which were referred to as humanists, which I'll talk about that term in a second too, viewed themselves as doing something new. They said, we are affecting a rebirth of classical culture. Greece and Rome. We're more like Greece and Rome, ancient Greece and Rome, than we are like what's come before. And what's taken place between Greece and Rome, classical civilization, and what we are now doing has just been one long dark age. That's where the term the Dark Ages, referring to medieval Europe, originated. Now, Burckhardt took that as reality and said this was a real thing. Whereas the scholars who were proposing this didn't really know what they were talking about. They're also being very polemical, and that is a problem. Once we start taking polemics as historical development, we have a problem. And that's what really Burckhardt did. Now, again, Burckhardt was brilliant. It's a brilliant work, a classic work. The problem is that people just followed in Burckhardt, and it got to be a real problem. I could go into all kinds of issues there. In 1926, I believe it was, Charles Homer Haskins, an American medievalist, published a book called The Renaissance of the 12th Century, arguing a lot of the developments that Burckhardt saw as being 14th, 15th century developments were already there in the 12th century. Classicism, law, humanities, and so. Now, I can't get into all of this, or again, we'd be teaching a whole course on the Renaissance. But I want to say something about the term humanists, because it's so often misunderstood. In terms of the Renaissance, the term humanist referred to the teachers of the humanities, just as an artist was referred to as a teacher who taught the liberal arts, and a legist was someone who taught law or scholar in law. In the medieval universities, there was no place for history or poetry or literature or other things that we could talk about, the humanities. It was logic and rhetoric, astronomy, physics, those kinds of things, but not history, not philosophy as such, even though it was very philosophical, but not as a separate discipline. But these disciplines were referred to as the humaniora, the more humane disciplines. And the study of that was called the Studia Humanitatis, the study of the humanities, of humanity. Humanitas is being human. So it's the study of being human. Being a humanist was a teacher of the humanities. It does not mean that they weren't Christian, and that the whole concept today of what's called secular humanism is a modern development. It has nothing to do with the Renaissance. There was no scholar in the Renaissance who was a humanist who ever was questioning Christianity. They would question the church, the institutional church, the ecclesiastics, but they never questioned Christianity. Along with this new educational program, because that's what it was, humanism was an educational program in opposition to the medieval universities, there also became opportunity politically for what has been called the new men, of death and opportunity. And here we see the relationship between this new development and the Black Death. Because the Black Death, I said last week, or last lecture, was an aggregate, approximately a third of the population died. So all of a sudden, there's all kinds of opportunity. And with opportunity, then it becomes legitimating it. If I seize control of a city-state in Italy, how do I legitimate it? If I can't appeal to my inheritance, my lineage, and my nobility, but simply because of my prowess in battle and seizing the opportunity, how do I start to legitimate that? And that developed then this whole concept of authority, power, and rule that began to be different from what the basis of authority had been, always given from God, earlier on within Christendom. So this new concept of if I can grab authority, I can have authority, and then the question is, how can I keep it? And that was actually Machiavelli's question that he asked and then answered in his book called The Prince, which was written in 1512. I don't think it was published until a little bit later, when he said that, here's how you go about getting rule, seizing rule, and keeping it. very much based on quote unquote reality, practical politics. I talk a lot about that as well, but again, this is already, I'm taking more time than I had planned for all of this. That's part of this new mentality too, though, this renaissance of authority and ability to seize the opportunity. Then the economy. And I'm just going to say this something briefly about the medieval and Renaissance economy. Banking really develops in the later 13th century and on to the 14th century. We have double entry bookkeeping being developed. We have means of financing being developed, deficit financing in the Monte in Florence was a way people could invest in the public debt. So there are all types of economic developments in the economy and in banking that led to this concept of usury, which had always been seen as a case, which was still in the books, was okay, actually. We could charge interest. That had to get, there had to be ways around that because in the Christian moral theology in the Middle Ages, usury was a sin. You could loan somebody money, but you could only do so if you had no hopes of getting it back and you could not charge interest. That's where some of the tensions then with Jews came along, and Jews became the bankers of popes and of emperors because they had no problem charging interest. It wasn't a sin. Usury was not a sin in the Jewish moral world. That became then problematic with Jewish bankers becoming very wealthy. What do we do? How do we counter that? And so then Christian bankers started coming up and rising up. We have the Medici in Florence and finding ways around that sin of usury while still enriching ourselves. So that's the kind of what was going on in the Renaissance too, developing new ideas of economy, finance, and managing of wealth in many ways. And then the classical ideals in medieval science and technology. Medieval science is so misunderstood by most people who don't study medieval science. And I can't go into it all here either. I would love to teach a course on medieval science, and it was on the books, but that's a long story as well. But so often it's misunderstood because some basic approaches to understanding the natural world that we associate with science and with the scientific revolution were developed in the Middle Ages. The issue on natural causation, how can we explain what we observe? That was a medieval development. How do we understand technology? We have all kinds of technological developments in the Middle Ages, from eyeglasses to the mechanical clock, and on we go to the spyglass, what was called the spyglass, lens making. There was a lot of scientific and technological development in the Middle Ages, and mathematical development. Calculus was almost discovered by the Oxford calculators, where it was a group of scholars in Oxford in the 14th century known as the Oxford calculators. Just quite. But they did not have the notation to really go further. They wrote everything with Roman numerals. Anyway, it was a great achievement. Medieval science was a great achievement and is background to what we'll be talking about later with the scientific revolution. I'll come back to some of this. But it's also an attitude and approach. It's not just what God says. It's not just belief. It is reason. The Middle Ages has been called an age of reason, not just by me. There's a book, God and Reason in the Middle Ages, by Edward Grant, who's one of the great historians of science, one of the early historians of science. He says, to understand the Middle Ages, we have to see it as an age of reason. That's what it was. And we go from there, but that contributes to this new look onto the Renaissance and this new approach with the economic developments, with the crusading ideal coming all together, and that provides the background for what has been called the Age of Discovery. Now, finally, we get to the Age of Discovery, and here with wealth, greed, and missionary zeal. Also, a medieval development was trade, long-distance international trade. To understand colonialization, what was going on, we have to understand it in this sense of wealth, and then, of course, greed. I read you the Folklore of Shard says, well, God wanted us to have it, so we humbly follow God's will. I'm not going to comment on that philosophically or theologically, but that was the mentality, very much almost like a medieval form of the prosperity gospel, so to speak. I'm not going to comment on that theologically either, but that's kind of, if prosperity gospel means anything to you, this is like a medieval form of it. But it's not that it came from nothing. It's not like Europe was all sitting there within itself and all of a sudden said, oh my gosh, let's go explore. Trade was already there. And I